Hey, Jason.
Good morning.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, good. Hey, I'm just checking to see if you needed anything before you start. We've still got like about 5 minutes, so
No,
looks like you got your screen sharing okay.
yep, I think I'm good. I'm going to get all my windows kind of configured here, and then I think we're ready to
Awesome.
rock and roll.
Sweet, sweet.
Yep.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
mute and turn off the video. Just let me know if you need anything.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I appreciate
And
it.
just to let you know, we're already recording. We'll be recording the whole thing through,
Great.
and so yeah.
So stop picking my nose is what you're saying. So
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Neiffer, and this is the 11 a.m. Mountain Moot session on Reading Still Matters. I'm going to give this maybe another minute or two because I know that the transitioning takes a little longer in the virtual version of this. So. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Again, good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. Again, my name is Jason Neiffer. This is Reading Still Matters, Reconsidering Actual Literacy and Digital Learning. I am the Assistant Director and Curriculum Director of the Montana Digital Academy, which is the state virtual school that's located on the University of Montana campus in fabulous Missoula, Montana. As I'm sure many of you are, I'm joining you from my home office today as I am sheltering in place like many other digital learning professionals from Missoula today. And I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this particular topic. It's been something that's been swimming around in my head for quite some time. And I first gave a version of this talk at the Digital Learning Annual Conference in Austin, Texas in February. I received a lot of great feedback from that particular presentation that I've kind of weaved into this. And of course, you know, here we are in July 2020, and the whole notion of when digital learning works and when it doesn't has taken obviously a much increased consideration in schools across the United States and around the world. So before we get started on the slides of my presentation, I would encourage you, I will definitely stop at the end for questions. If you have questions in the intermediary, I will try to take a look at the chat. Even though I am definitely a multiple monitor person, I find that the Zoom is not as wonderful as I would hope in regards to providing good access to chat. So,
Jason,
yeah, go ahead.
if you like, I can monitor. Kind of here as a moderator, monitor anyway. I can monitor the chat. And do you want me to break in if there's a question? Or
yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'll try. I think there's 4 or 5. There's also 4 or 5 places where I think it's a natural place to stop. That'd be wonderful. Thanks, Ellen.
Okay. Well, if you want to just break where you're planning on taking a break, that would be even better. That
awesome.
would work better.
Great. Thank you so much. And then I thought that I would give you a quick tour of available resources here. Obviously, my slides are available in the Moodle shell. I've also put up a Wakelet, which is a kind of a digital playlist maker. I'm a big fan of Wakelet as a digital learning tool. And so everything I refer to today, with one exception, is located here. I like to refer to research and conversations in academia when I look at various aspects of learning. And so everything I refer to today is located in that Wakelet. The link is there. And then I have been very impressed with WooClap. I almost called it WooChat, WooClap, which is a kind of a live interactivity tool. And I thought I'd start off today by getting a little bit of sense of who you are as an audience. And so I would like you to just open up another browser window. If you go to wooclap.com/newpuppy, which is what I'm calling my WooClap this morning. I would love it if you'd answer a couple questions for me, and I'll share back the information with you in the audience just so you can get a sense of this. And part of this is I want to kind of get a an inside look in your head if the issues I'm going to talk about today are, truly something that you are thinking about, whether you're a teacher or administrator or instructional designer, even an IT person, when you talk about distance or digital learning. So again, wooclap.com/new puppy is the thing that we're utilizing today. So the first question I have for you is, what sector do you work in? I've provided a lot of different looks at this today. I have a suspicion on who's in here, but we'll see if I'm correct or not. Again, wooclap.com/new puppy. And many of you work in lots of different pieces here. Feel free to mark multiple times. Okay, results are largely in, and as I am not surprised, the K-5 sector dominates the session today. Some middle school and high school, relatively few in higher ed, and then some folks here today in support of teachers and also in the corporate or government professional learning realm. I will tell you, I wish this was a bigger topic of conversation, especially amongst high school students. I'm sorry, high school, probably students, high school teachers, and also in college professionals, especially if you're working with populations that tend to struggle with learning. But definitely thank you for those that are in high school and in college content classrooms that are here today. Okay, a second question I have for you today is, tell me what your role is in the world. Are you mostly teachers, school administrators, IT people, et cetera, et cetera? I have a suspicion here too. My suspicion seems correct in light of the early results. Again, if you're just joining us, we're on wooclap.com/new puppy. Great, and very much a teacher crowd. Although thank you to the 3 IT people that showed up today. Okay, next. This one I struggled a little bit in how to kind of stage this. I borrowed this from a slide I made earlier this week, but tell me a little bit about what your background is in things like content reading or teaching reading or support reading. Lots of folks with formal background, advanced coursework. You took a content area literacy class back in college. Shout out to the one of you that said you could teach this workshop. I look forward to your workshop review. And the last one, again, I also struggle with wording on this a little bit, in part because I am kind of curious if you are keeping things like literacy or text complexity or reading level into account when you are engaging in picking text, instructional design. Maybe you don't have an answer to this. That's fine too. Okay, great. I'm just so thrilled to hear about the text complexity issue being either amongst many concerns or a top or primary concern. Okay, thank you for participating there. That gives me a little bit of sense of this and also kind of introduces you a little bit to your colleagues in the session today. So before we get into the meat of things, if you've heard me speak before, you know that I love context. Like I think every conversation, every workshop session should start with some notion of why I'm talking about this. And again, like I mentioned earlier, this is actually a presentation I've given before, but before the COVID thing went down. And so my context of this is not as much rooted in the last 4 months about why distance, remote, emergency remote teaching, whatever we want to call that, worked or didn't work, but I have a broader concern to this. And so first and foremost, like I mentioned earlier, I'm the assistant director of the Montana Digital Academy. It's the state virtual school in Montana. We actually started in 2010. I was employee number 2, hired in February 2010. And we're really proud that we're celebrating our 10th year anniversary this year as a distance learning program in the state of Montana, especially since many people thought that we would be a 1 to 3 year phenomenon and then would go down in history as another attempt at creating a distance learning program in the state of Montana. And part of what I am always interested in is first and foremost, you know, what are we doing that's right? So in other words, getting a sense from our students and teachers what is going well in our program. But obviously, I'm also hugely concerned of what happens when things are not going right, and to see if there's something we can do in order to make the environment better. And so we've served literally tens of thousands of students in the past 10 years, and we have a lot of pretty good indications that what we're doing is working for the vast majority of students. We regularly survey our students to find out what they like and don't like. We do a student perception survey every semester, and that survey says that anywhere from 77% to 95% of our students are either satisfied or very satisfied with their MTDA course. We have lots of students that end up taking very hesitantly an online course and then stick around and take 4 or 5 more in their high school career. We're very proud of those numbers, and it's something that you know, we're very proud of. But I always look at the data of those that are not successful very curiously, and if you start to drill down into, let's say, a group of students that don't find it successful, or those students that are critics of the program or disaffected by the program, I'm really interested in that subset of students. And I focus a lot of my personal research and energy into what can we do to add something to the program to make that a little more responsive to student needs. But one of the things that I think is unhelpful here is the fact that there is, when distance learning doesn't work, it tends to inspire an extraordinary amount of vitriol that I think is not useful, nor is it very, I guess, evolutionary in the process. And when I say this is not working for the subset of students, it's not because I think that distance learning, online learning, remote teaching, remote learning is necessarily suspect, even though I think that's the way mainstream education tends to treat it, but rather we should focus our energies in why that's the case and then work together to find solutions to problems. And one of the things I like to mention when I talk about at least research-based solutions when it comes to distance learning is there is relatively few high-quality studies that actually compare distance learning to face-to-face learning. But secondarily, well, let me show you the one that I refer to. By the way, coronavirus obviously has made this infinitely more complex in the last 4 months. You cannot pick up a newspaper article about our time in remote teaching in the last couple of months. This is something that's been echoed by the President of the United States, that online learning was the term he used, wasn't working. Of course, I don't think remote teaching and online learning are the same thing, but I think our inclination to immediately blame the format, I think, is not very productive to figuring out solutions for students. But I cite this study a lot. It's a kind of a meta-analysis of available studies on online learning, and this is from EdWeek. But one of the things that I like to point out is that there is a very clear indicator in available studies that in-person courses are on average more effective. So efficacy is the purpose here, than distance learning or online courses. And on average, students do worse in the online setting. And this is particularly true for students with weaker academic background. That's an interesting notion to me. But the other thing I also like to point out when talking about a look at the available studies is that there isn't very many studies that, well, actually, there's really no studies that used the kinds of things we would call gold standards for research, including things like randomized trials. Obviously, we can't have a randomized anonymous blind study because you obviously know if you're in an online class or in a face-to-face class if you're assigned to that, but relatively few studies have been done to really compare. But the thing that I think is really interesting about this is that because there's so much focus, I think, on effectiveness, we don't often talk about the quality of online learning, and also what strategies we can take on as learning professionals to make digital learning environments more effective for students. And I think that is extremely important. And I'm going to just quickly cite a few studies. All of these are available in Wakelet for you to go later, but some examples of things that studies look at when finding out what makes the best or more successful online students. This study says tech skill, GPA, past achievement, content background, and they also cite reading scores as all indicators of potential positive success in an online environment. Although, to be frank, tech skills, GPA, past achievement, content background, and reading scores are probably an indicator of success in a face-to-face environment as well. This study says GPA orienting students and reading scores is an indicator of potential success in the environment. This one says self-discipline and motivation is an indicator of future success in an online environment. This particular study, this is from South Africa, says that reading is the primary indicator, like reading level and the ability to read is a primary indicator. This one talks about GPA and also reading ability. And so what's consistent about these studies is even though there are lots of factors that go into it, the ability to read is extremely important. And in fact, if you start digging into research about what makes good multimedia learning or good distance learning, my favorite book for this is E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. There's a link to this in the Wakelet. It's an expensive book. I think used copies run $30 to $40. But to be honest, if you're interested in this topic, this can really turn into an instructional Bible for you in thinking about designing good online learning. It goes back to the fact that design matters more than just about anything else. And if design matters, then we should probably be thinking about, can we design something into the learning environment that can help students that may struggle ultimately in reading? And I'll give you two other examples that are more direct to my day-to-day work. Again, I mentioned that we give a student perception survey to students every semester to try to get a sense of what they liked and didn't like. And I pulled two comments from our fall 2019 student perception survey. This one was extremely telling. I found it difficult to learn from the lessons. I read them many times and they didn't stick. That's something that is very telling for a reason I'll talk about in a moment. And then we get a comment like this almost every session. Why can't this just be all video, right? Why can't you just put a bunch of videos online for me to learn? And as it turns out, there is, relatively a little support of actually video being a primary driver of a course. And one of the things I like to remind our teachers that want to use more video is we have folks that really think that if they just turn a camera on and YouTube up their 45-minute lecture, that students are just going to jump on top of that and be engaged and amazed. I got to say, I perceive that I'm a pretty good lecturer, and I don't think that strategy would be very successful for me. And then the way I sometimes describe it to teachers is, imagine for a moment going to a large lecture hall. University of Montana, right, has classes sometimes that are 400 or 500 kids, although probably not this fall. And there are some folks on the UM campus that are absolutely enamoring enamoring from their audience because they are such eloquent speakers and wise and clever and witty. And, imagine giving the lecture hall of 600 kids, putting everyone in that room and giving them all a stop button, right? So that they can press a button and that person stops. And are you telling me that if 600 kids had a stop button, that not one of them would press the stop button at some point, even if they had to listen to the lecture. Well, that's what YouTube is, right? YouTube is, even if you have enormously engaging content, you know, we don't give students in a face-to-face classroom a stop button and say, you know, when you're tired of this, just press this button and it'll stop. You know, that piece for me, I think is pretty important. But I also think that there's some complexity here too, just because text on a screen is also confusing from a market standpoint. Recent studies, 92% of college students say they prefer print books to ebooks. That number has been replicated in other studies. Also, other college students say they prefer a print for long form reading, but ebooks for research. And if you think about that for a second, it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you're moving through a book, you probably want to move through the book in your preferred element. If you're researching, you probably want Control F to be able to find stuff or go just to what you're looking for. But, you know, you start to think about this through for a second, and it may be that reading is a much bigger factor in the success of distance learning than we think. Now, I got to warn you, this is the ultimate rabbit hole, right? You start to think through this and it gets really gross really quick, because you start to chase your own research tail, and then you're thinking, well, maybe these other factors are in place. I will warn you that that in looking at reading as a factor, that I myself get confused and sometimes end up you know, like in a Wikipedia hole, right? Or a research hole where I spend 3 hours in Google Scholar and then ultimately find the study that I started off with. But I will tell you that we are starting to take this very seriously in my institution, especially as it relates to disaffected learners. And we have really two strategies that I want to talk about today. The first one is we need to help add content reading support directly into courses. And I have some ideas about that today. And then second, we absolutely need to directly and very purposefully help students become more digital reading savvy. When we lose them in our face-to-face environment, I think sometimes we tend to be a little more on the side of we're going to give students resources and hope they swim on their own. I believe strongly that we need to take a more proactive approach at providing an opportunity for students to kind of think about that process. And by the way, I believe for us, at least, this is a work in progress. I don't have any final answers here. And so the things I'm going to talk about today are ideas that we are trying with no results yet. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. I don't think there's been any particular questions, but I can open up for just a moment if anyone has a thought about kind of our contextual stuff today.
Jason,
Hey,
I know.
Jason.
Oh,
Sorry,
excuse.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jason, have you? I know this is about reading, but can you weigh in a little bit on the books on tape kind of thing, the audio reading? I know it's not classical reading, but how that factors in, maybe.
Well, it factors in from the standpoint that if you can get access to, I think, like professionally produced audio, I think that can be a very engaging thing. But what I don't know the answer to, and I'm sure there's research on this, I'm just not directly aware of it, is if you're doing that with content reading, if that makes a difference. The one thing I do know that there is a fairly persuasive research story to this point is that I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, artificial voices, so having a screen reader read it to you, is not as effective as having a human voice read it to you from the standpoint of understanding the text or remembering the text later. The other thing I would also question, and something I'll talk about when I talk about text reading in a moment, is that if you're not interacting with the text, and what I mean by interacting is thinking about it in another context, writing down information, reviewing it later. My guess is that text is probably, or that audio text is not as effective if you're not doing something with that information.
Good thoughts. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for the question.
So one thing that we kind of ran into when we were developing a bunch of our online content is the managers and everything wanted actual procedures, which were step-by-step guides with screenshots from the program that we're going to be training the employees on. And what ended up happening is one of the managers that was the most particular about it required that everything was written in active voice. And it was also, because she was a lawyer by education, it seemed incredibly high reading level for the employees that we were going to be training. Any issue or any suggestions on how to kind of let them know, hey, I think this is too complex or too high of a reading level to where your employees are not going to get it?
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say there's a lot. Your state Department of Labor probably has a workforce development information, including educational background of typical job titles in your given state. I know the Department of Labor has this information. I would dig on that to find out if the job titles that you're training, what the typical educational background is, and if it's just at high school level, or if it's just at a two-year college level, or if the predominance of the employees are not high school graduates, or I guess maybe the category of barely high school graduates, then toning down that reading. I'm going to give you one tool today that can kind of help you evaluate reading level. But yeah, I would say that trying to find out more about your target audience and then directing some analysis to that, I think, is extremely important. I think we presume adults.
Sorry, go ahead, Jason.
No, please.
What I was going to say is a majority of the positions that we're hired against, and that's why they're getting paid so low, is because they're all considered entry-level positions. So high school education would be good enough.
Right.
I know they are all high school grads, but as far as any kind of college education and everything, I don't have the statistics on that. But I think what we're running into is a lot of folks that are getting hired into these entry-level positions. They just don't understand the content that we're writing.
Right. Well, and one of the facts I think we tend to forget, and you don't hear this cited as much, in part because our media landscape is diversified, typical highly read newspapers. So I'm talking more like the USA Today and Newsweek, as opposed to maybe the Washington Times and, the Business Weekly. The mainstream publications are aimed at a sixth grade level, right? Like that's the reading level that is pretty average for mainstream media sources. A little more in some, a little less in others. But if we are expecting that out of critical things like the news, and then we're writing things at even a 12th grade level or middle college reading level, I think you'd run into issues almost right away. And the evidence isn't just that you don't get the information, right? That's bad enough. But then if it becomes distracting, boring, or you disengage with it, which is what I'm supposing today is part of it, you're going to disengage with stuff that you don't understand or get, then I think you're just setting yourself up for really a not successful implementation of content.
I appreciate that, Jason. Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so let me talk about a couple of our strategies here. One of the strategies, actually, that's the wrong slide. One of the strategies, again, is that we are going to, or we're working on trying to help students become more digital reading savvy. And again, this goes back to, the evidence is that people, when given choices, don't like screens, right? So there is certainly comprehension issues and early research about this. The reading on paper actually increases comprehension. Secondarily, we strongly believe that we should design around that. But I want to point out one other study, because it's going to kind of dominate my slides for the rest of today. I thought this was really interesting, and so much so that I started using this in my professional life. The key here is that people tend to take suggestions better when you frame it as advice as opposed to feedback, right? So we're trying to work on some language on how to do that in context of distance learning, but we're going to not teach kids, we're going to advise kids on better ways to read digitally, right? So this is advice we're going to give kids on how to pull this off. The first one is something that I've not been able to dig into enough to speak to it authoritatively, but I think there's an extraordinary amount of potentially great stuff here, and that is the Microsoft Immersive Reader. And if you are in a Microsoft institution, of which I am not, MTDA is Google-based, the Immersive Reader is a free tool that takes web pages and it turns them into really interesting reading opportunities, including bigger text without distraction, and adds in layers in tools, including picture dictionaries for younger students that can help you make it through text in a more concrete way. And this is actually the most innovative thing I've seen out of Microsoft in quite some time in regards to learning. But they're starting to build this into lots of different parts of their tools. But if you're a Microsoft institution, again, of which we are not, consider looking at this as an opportunity to take whatever text you're using, give it as an opportunity or a tool to students in hopes they will use this to become better readers of the content that you're pushing. My understanding is that it works, although it's in beta, I think, in the Microsoft Edge browser. That's the new version of the Edge browser, which means it could work on literally any text. But that's one piece of advice I would have, is that if you're in a Microsoft institution, definitely look into that. But I have a more simplistic solution that works across all different browsers that we are going to start advising students on. This is a great tool by Postlight. Postlight is a e-development shop in New York City. It's where the former editor of Lifehacker, Gina Trapani, works, who is kind of like my productivity guru, but they've worked on something called the Mercury Reader. And one of the things that I think is really problematic about sending kids out to the internet is that the internet is made to distract you into reading more. And there's plenty of evidence of this, but I'm gonna look at just a good example here. I hate to go here because I'm sure the advertising's terrible. Here we go, the Missoulian. I might have an advertising blocker turn. Oh, no, I don't, because there's plenty of advertising. But if you send kids out to the internet to look at an article that is on popular media, and this is also true of more scientific or research sources, when they click on it, there's tons of stuff here that really is encouraging you to do something in addition to reading this article, right? Whether it's clicking on an ad or looking at this RBG article or whatever you want to look at. This thing is actually kind of a spammy looking article anyways, but what the Mercury Reader does is, by clicking on the Mercury Reader, is that it takes, and of course it's going to work on this spammy article. Lab nabbit. Let me look at an article that's not terrible, and then we can go from there. Like this wonderful one about the Missoula County Public Schools. I've reached my free... I'm going to go to CNN instead. I've reached my free article into the Missoulian. Actually, subscribe. Is there not bad news on here somewhere? Sharks pull 10-year-old boy from boat. Nope, that's not it. COVID fight. Nope. Dog food problem. Nope. Nope. Yeah, lots of bad news today. Twitter hack is worse. Nope. I'm looking for something nice. Here we go. An island was won on a poker game for 17 million. Obviously an important content article, right? But, when CNN puts up articles, right, a mainstream news source, there's literally a dozen places here that are begging for your attention that have nothing to do with the article, right? And if it's not, CNN sending you to other articles, this is all paid advertising content to send you elsewhere. You can't compel kids to completely ignore that based on this suggestion. But what I love about the Mercury Reader is that it takes articles like this and it brings it down to just the content itself, right? And it pulls the content into a readable format. It does have the ability to send it to a Kindle if you want to do that as well. I love this a lot. But this particular plugin requires no account. It requires nothing more extensive than installing the plugin on your browser, and it provides a really clean learning experience. And one of the ways that I think is problematic if you use internet-based content in an e-learning course, and a lot of good courses do, is that you can lose kids by sending them out to that, and the distraction means they're going to spend 10 more minutes on it than they actually should. So we're working on advice in our orientation materials, and also in some very specific instances where we know kids struggle with reading, and we send them out to the internet to say, if you're going to read on the internet, that's fine, but please consider using this plugin. And I would also say, if you're managing like Google apps for education in your school and you manage Chrome browsers or have Chromebooks, this is one of the few plugins I would say should be on every student and teacher's machines automatically installed, because I think it provides an extraordinary opportunity for students. By looking at advice, and this kind of shows you another way to look at that, is that by sharing this advice, I think you can start to build some capacity in students to take away the notion of the distraction, especially when they're going out to the internet to be able to do that. Okay. The second piece of advice that I think is important is that you have to teach study skills. And part of it is that I think this notion that students are going to watch a video or read content, whether it's e-learning content or internet content, and learn it by simply passively reading or simply listening or watching a video, I think is pretty suspect from a pedagogy standpoint. And one of the things that we're working on for our struggling students at MTDA especially is that you gotta do something with the content. And unfortunately, lots of people have pretty strong misnomers about, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, what or how e-learning should work. We've had parents say, like the comment from a student earlier, that my kid reads this stuff, but they're not doing anything with it, or they're not learning it. So I asked, well, are they writing anything down? Are they reviewing the information? Are they doing anything with that information? And the answer is almost universally no. They're just reading it and expecting to pick it up one time through with a passage on a screen. And so we have started digging deeply into note-taking research, not only when it's effective and why and who it's aimed at. We're looking at various regimes of providing guided note-taking. There's also another concept called skeleton notes that we're also looking at that has a little bit of research base behind it. But as it turns out, there is a lot of research that supports that if you're reading something and not jotting something down, even concepts may be confusing to you, and then review them within first 12 hours, then 24 hours, that chances of that information making it into your brain is much lower in your long-term memory. And we're even going as far as starting to look at research about that probably should be a paper notebook as opposed to a digital notebook. And this one's a little more controversial, and I know some people disagree about this device. I see Dr. Fryer's joined us this morning, and he and I have talked about this one a little bit on our podcast. But I'm still a big fan of notebooks. This is my $1 composition notebook I get from the dollar store down the street, and I'm a big fan of notebooks, and part of it because I was a paper person as a kid. But there's a lot of evidence that says that writing down is actually more effective than typing out notes, in part because of the cognitive processes involved. And without digging into that, it's at least something that we're keeping a look at, and we'll see if that's replicated. But in addition to that, we also teach note-taking systems, right? That's something we also think is important, especially for our struggling students. I like Cornell. I used to teach Cornell as a teacher, especially to my younger students or my first-time AP students. It's funny, Cornell was trending yesterday on Twitter, and originally it was about some coronavirus research, and then the trend was hijacked by people that were just trashing on Cornell notes because they hated them, and someone called them devil notes and stuff, which I thought was pretty entertaining Twitter piece. But there is a lot of evidence behind Cornell notes, but there are dozens of quote note-taking systems out there. I like Cornell notes. You might find another one, but the important piece here is that sometimes it's not just enough to present the materials to them. You have to provide an opportunity to interact with the text of the processes. Okay, strategy number 2, engage in nuanced learning design. And I want to introduce you to a concept that is way bigger than we have time to talk about today. But if you haven't heard of UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, it's a framework on how you make learning materials more accessible, not as in like, well, accessibility is a part of it, but there's lots of parts of UDL that I think are pretty important, are pretty interesting. As it turns out, that is, it's a huge rabbit hole, right? Like you start to get into UDL and it's pretty huge, but UDL is a good start here because you can add in some things that might help students that struggle with basic core literacy. But the other thing I would also encourage you to do too is that if you haven't picked up a content area reading textbook lately, and the one edition back of these textbooks are always available for next to nothing on Amazon used because they're constantly releasing new versions. But I have two great recommendations for you: the Subjects Matter book that I'm talking about here, and also Content Area Reading, Literacy, and Learning Across the Curriculum. This is actually the 10th edition, I believe, of the same book that I learned about in the early 90s in the ed department at Carroll. But there are good strategies that you can add on to lessons, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment, add on to lessons to make them more effective for students that you know struggle with reading. And just because it's on a screen doesn't make it not reading. And if you don't want to read a textbook or utilize one of those strategies, also consider that there are great pages here that help you with this as well. This Teach Thought page, again, is in the Wakelet. This is a really, really, really good description of additional strategies. But if you yourself are a content teacher and you do not have reading support available in your academic institution, strongly consider putting together digital versions of these when it makes sense, and then have it available to you as part of that process. Question chat about the grade levels that are focused on the content area reading book. I believe it is focused K-12. But it's usually in content area reading is usually a class aimed at 6th through 12th graders in higher ed institutions, in part because they want, the social studies teacher like me to have some background in this process. In addition, I would also strongly consider that you think about reading level of text depending on who you are working with in the context of your classroom. We talked about this a little bit more in questions, but the Subjects Matter book I referred to earlier said that reading level is way, way, way more important than typically is kept in mind, especially in learning environments. And I don't have a great strategy here other than what's really interesting to me is if you go try to buy digital content, very rarely will they have reports available to you and metrics available on reading level. But at the same time, there is very little in the way of data or information for you. While if you buy a print textbook, they can usually provide you pages and pages and pages of analyzed data on what the reading level is. And so I have kind of a hint here. There are plugins you can do. The one I currently have installed, there's 3 or 4 of them, and I tend to delete them and go to others. But if you are looking at a content article, this plugin is called, I think it's YScan is the name. You can oftentimes get an indicator about what the reading level is of a particular page. So I'm going to click on YScan here. This is a Chrome plugin. And this one is reading level 5, so there's a high reading level to it. I'm going to go ahead and guess that's probably overplaying it a little bit because this is an article about winning a Great Barrier Reef Island in a poker game. But at the same time, at least doing some basic analysis on reading level, I think is pretty important. There's reading level metrics in Microsoft Word. There is plugins you can get in Google Docs to be able to do this. But if you are utilizing a lot of web-based resources and your learners are low reading level learners, you have to spend a little bit of time making sure that the content itself is aimed at the reading level that you are aiming the group at. Okay. And then the last strategy related to this that we're thinking about at MTDA is how do you layer in instruction for reading? And part of it is that we have students that are very advanced students taking classes with us, whether it's an AP student in an AP class or an AP student in a core class that are not taking an AP environment, that don't really want our reading instruction. Like, even if it would be kind of useful to them, it would be clunky to compel students to, look at the reading instruction. And so this is where kind of some specific Moodle stuff is useful. We are looking at the ways that we can layer in reading instruction for students, right? So this is a development shell. We're far, far away from getting to a point where this is going to be live. This is kind of in the MTDA labs, if you will. But this notion of, we'll tell you about Cornell Notes, but we're not going to tell you to use take notes on something if you don't need to hear that, right? So Moodle has a really great feature where you can limit things like labels or even whole assignments to certain groups. And so we're looking at what happens if we can create a LSL. For us stands for learning strategy layers. I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But if a student needs help on study skills, offer that student study skills on a lesson that they will need study skills on, right? But don't make other students look at stuff that they already know, or just becomes clunky stuff for them to skip over if they're looking at it. And so we've come up with this concept of, adding in learning strategies only when it's important to do so. So this is what it looks like in the teacher view in Moodle. This is what it looks like in a student view if you're in a group that is identified as a learning skills lacking student. We could add in advice and links to tutorials and extra information as a learning strategy layer. This is, we think, a really winning strategy. The problem we run into is that it's extremely time consuming to make it to where it's only aimed at the learners that need it, right? A great comment from Terry and Chad about it'd be nice to have some kind of pre-assessment to see who needs the learning skills lesson. Absolutely. Or if we can get adults that are rowing students in our environment to identify students that need more strategies. And then also, Peggy mentions that, does it leave it up to the student to decide, or can the instructor suggest it strongly? Well, I think you can set it up both ways, right? A student can self-identify, or a teacher can force them into the group that adds in those extra strategies where the kid thinks they do or not. We have literally dozens of ideas of learning strategy layers, and you don't need to read through all of this, just gives you an idea of what we're thinking about. Tech support, whether it's Moodle tutorials, Google Drive stuff, tech tips, curriculum support, obviously learner support, language, reading, writing, alternative materials, alternative languages, deadline reminders, time management support, etc. But the problem is that, when we work in this kind of stuff for learning strategy layers, it creates a real beast of a course. The second piece that's also critical is that, the stuff, we're doing a good job on number one. We're layering in tech support, but the rest of the stuff takes time that we just don't have. And then, of course, time is in part money, right? And we are I would say, a modestly funded organization when it comes to having support for teachers in that way. We're working on it a lot. We think that there's a lot of promise here, but we're thinking about that. And then we have another cool term that we use about this that we call it accordion design. Like, courses should be able to flex bigger or smaller depending on the learner that's in the course, right? So if a student is advanced and doesn't need RBS, then like all of our extra information and our advice on this and the sage advice on being a good e-learner, they're advanced learner, they're self-regulated, they're awesome. The course should be as small as possible, right? So the student views it as gets the extra information when they need it, but if they don't need it, then the course should just be the stuff, right? So that's a struggling learner. That's an advanced learner, and the course is bigger or smaller depending on, if they need that information or not. And we're a big fan of this notion. It's just that it takes time and money to be able to set that process up. So hey, that's basically the stuff that I want to talk about today in regards to this particular process. Again, everything that I've talked about today is in that Wakelet. All of it's really good reading. I've also got links to all the books I mentioned today. If you've not picked up a content area literacy textbook in 20 years, I will tell you that you will be shocked about how useful the information is, especially if you've been designing for students online for a while. A lot of the struggle, I think, of developing good distance learning, online blended learning, digital materials, I think is well covered and thoughtfully executed in a content area textbook that covers reading. And again, even if you get an older version of it, it's going to give you the basics. But that's a little bit about what we're doing in that realm. So I will certainly leave it open to questions. You can unmic yourself if you have any comments or thoughts, or if you want to correct something that I said that you have some expertise on, I more than welcome any thought that you have today.
Really great presentation, Jason. I really appreciate your nuggets that you dropped to us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Glad you found it useful.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and close out this Zoom session, if that's okay with everyone. We do appreciate all the chat and all the great conversation going on in the chat, but I do need to clear this. I do need to close it out. So kind of try to connect with each other through the Moodle course or something like that. So thanks a lot, everyone.